Hello, everyone. I want to welcome I want to welcome you to tonight's special program with Harriet Washington and her new book, Carte Blanche: The Erosion of Medical Consent. You can get that book at the website of Revolution Books, revolutionbooksnyc.org. My name is Raymond Lotta. I'm a political economist. I write for revcom.us. I am an advocate for the new communism developed by Bob Avakian, and I'm on the staff of Revolution Books here in Harlem. We have a sister store in Berkeley, and on behalf of Revolution Books, we welcome you all to this program. We're very honored and excited to have Harriet Washington with us. Harriet is the author of the acclaimed book, Medical Apartheid, that documents the use and abuse of Black bodies by the medical system in the US since its founding from slavery to the present time. And in her new book, she details how Black people in particular, but the broader population as well, are being experimented upon without their consent by the medical system in the United States. I want to say something about Harriet. Harriet has been a research fellow at Harvard Medical School, where she studied clinical medical ethics. She is a research scholar at the National Center for Bioethics at Tuskegee University. And she teaches bioethics at Columbia University. She lectures there. In terms of the juncture at which we're holding this program, Harriet's new book, and the mission of Revolution Books, I just wanted to say something. We're confronting a very sharp situation. On the one hand, there is this whole ugly history of the abuse and exploitation of Black people by the medical system in the United States. On the other hand, we are confronting a very real pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a real virus. It is really affecting the Black community and other communities of color disproportionately. And there is a real vaccine that can help solve this crisis, but the people who need it most do not have access to it. So this is part of the situation and the challenge before us. It frames much of what we'll be talking about tonight. And that is, there is a fight for real science. There is a fight for medical ethics that Harriet has been at the forefront of. And there is the fight for the liberation of Black people as a central and crucial component of the revolution to put an end to all oppression and exploitation, to emancipate all of humanity. So with that as backdrop, I just want to tell you what our format's going to be tonight. Harriet's going to make a PowerPoint presentation. She's been here at Revolution Books before, and we've all gotten so much out of those PowerPoint presentations. That'll be followed by some conversation between the two of us, and I encourage all of you to send in your comments and your questions. They'll be coming in through, you can do this through Facebook. You can send them into revolutionbooksnyc.org, and we will put those questions and comments. Here we are on the screen, revbooksnyc@yahoo.com, or you can send them to YouTube or Facebook chat. So we'll be gathering those questions and comments, and you'll have the opportunity to engage with Harriet that way. After our conversation, as I said, We'll bring you in, and then I want to say a few words about Revolution Books calling upon you to support and get involved with the store. Again, I want to let people know that the book, Carte Blanche, The Erosion of Medical Consent, is available at our website, and you can come to the store to get a copy of it as well. So with that, I turn the program over very excitedly to Harriet Washington with her new book.
Thank you, Raymond, for that very generous introduction, and thank you to all of you who've come to hear what I have to say. Some rather disturbing things to say about American healthcare and medicine, but these are all things that are correctable. And I think that knowledge is power. So I'm going to try to impart to you what I have learned in hopes that we can join together and make for a more equitable healthcare system. Give me 1 second. There's slides I'd like to share with you. Even though I'm going to talk about this very American problem, it's important to realize that some of its roots are in the global South, in the developing world. And that is because that's where we first have seen evidence, or not more than evidence, actually, proof of a widespread abandonment of informed consent. Unfortunately, we've abandoned not only format, but the practice of informed consent. And there are a lot of reasons for that I'll get into later. But first, it's a really good idea to explain to you exactly what is informed consent. I think we all have a vague notion of it, and we all know or think that we know that in this country, nobody can be brought into medical research unless one gets your permission. That was true for a very long time, but as I'm going to explain tonight, it's not true any longer. But permission is not enough in this country. We don't consider enough to get someone's consent. We want to have informed consent, and informed consent refers to very specific information that has to be shared with someone who's a potential research subject. The idea is to give them all the information a person would need to make an intelligent and wise choice about whether or not they want to be in a study. So you tell them all about the study. You tell them what you're looking at, what you're trying to find out, how you propose to do it, why this is important. And you tell them in detail what's going to happen. Are they going to receive an experimental vaccine? Are they going to be given some other therapeutic or medicine? Are they going to be asked to curtail their lifestyle somehow, like change their diet? All this information has to be given to the person. Also, you have to tell them what the known risks are of the study. Notice I said known risk because it's a nature of medical research that even when it's conducted very ethically and the design is really superb, it's always risky. You can never separate risk from research because we simply don't know what's going to happen. We may certainly hope that the drug we're testing is going to help people and not cause serious side effects. But the only way to know for sure is to actually test it. So the known risks have to be told people, and you also tell them what you think the putative benefits will be. What is it you're trying to do for them? Are you trying to give them a vaccine that's going to protect them against an infectious disease that's raging? Are you trying to give them some other medication, say for their diabetes, that will halt the progression and the physical changes that are causing them to be at high risk for kidney disease and heart disease? All that information has to be shared with a person. And as the study progresses, you continue to share information. Suppose you learn during the course of the study that, for example, that redheads have a high rate of some kind of side effect. Then you would tell everyone in the study that. Everything a person needs to know to decide whether staying in the study is in his or her best interest has to be told them. You have to let them know that they can leave the study at any time. You have to let them know that no matter what they have signed, no matter what they have been paid, they always have the option of leaving. You also have to tell the person all their other options. If you are testing, for example, artificial blood for and Jehovah's Witnesses who don't want to accept natural blood because of their religious beliefs. You've got to tell them, well, your option is to be in the study. Your option is to change your mind and accept natural blood. Your option is to talk to your surgeon about other things that might be done to make the surgery bloodless. And your option is to take your chances by simply having surgery without blood available. You can't present to the person the study as their only option. So all this is all codified in U.S. law in the Code of Federal Regulations. But in 1996, there were two changes in that law, and they basically took some types of medical research and said you no longer have to do informed consent. In fact, you no longer have to do any consent at all. And what I'm going to talk to you tonight about is how this has happened, what effect it's already had on tens of thousands of Americans, and how it happened without anybody seeming to know about it. Very few lay people know that this is now the law. So all these really troubling questions are going to arise, and many of them are very pertinent to the pandemic that we find ourselves in. So I'm actually going to start there. These headlines might look familiar. These are headlines that ran last year. We have been reading these headlines about vaccine trials and how African Americans were failing to sign up for the trials. They were so afraid of them because of Tuskegee. And that was repeated over and over again. Fear of Tuskegee is keeping African Americans from signing up for clinical trials. And toward the end of the summer, I was reading truly alarming articles both in newspapers and in medical journals postulating that if African Americans continued to avoid the clinical trials, we might not end up with a vaccine that works. So the trouble was being laid at the feet of African Americans. African American negative behavior was being broadcast. But where was the proof? As I read these newspaper articles and I read the medical journals, I kept looking for data to bolster the claim that African Americans were not signing up for clinical trials. I couldn't see any numbers, and that made me suspicious. I like data. So finally, I was able to obtain numbers. A very generous researcher at Johns Hopkins, who doesn't know me at all, but immediately sent me the original data for two major clinical trials for the two vaccines that are now actually being given to people. And the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine had very similar rates of African Americans signing up, about 10%. 10% of the subjects in these clinical trials were African American. African Americans make up 12.3% of the US population. That means that African Americans were signing up for clinical trials very close to their percentage in the population. They were not avoiding the clinical trials. They were not refusing to sign up. Why were we reading headlines every day saying that they were? This demonization of African American behavior is something that is unfortunately been with us for a long time. And during the coronavirus pandemic, we have frequently seen blame the victim narrative promulgated around the behavior of African Americans. My question had also been, as I read these headlines, why the strict scrutiny on African Americans? You know, what are other ethnic groups doing? There's no worrying and hand-wringing about white Americans avoiding clinical trials. Were they not avoiding them? We don't know. No one was looking at them, even though most people in this country are white, and most of the people who would be avoiding clinical trials, if that was the case, would be white. You know, it's the behavior of whites in this scenario which actually would have dictated the development of the vaccine, and yet silence. No one was worrying about their participation. So this is a very troubling picture of medical bias and of a blame the victim mentality. So one of the arguments that was used to urge African Americans to sign up in high numbers was you have a higher infection risk, you have a higher death rate. You will benefit the most if a vaccine is developed, so you should sign up eagerly. You should sign up at higher numbers. But that's actually not a good argument. If you could argue that we have an approved, safe therapeutic, and so it would benefit you to sign up, that would be one thing, but it's being tested. We didn't know that it was safe. We didn't know that it was effective. We hoped that it would be, and it turned out it was, which is wonderful. But when you sign up for the trial, you're signing up for risk. You know, hopefully it will benefit you. There's almost definitely some risk there. And so you can't present that as a benefit to African Americans. Now, another really interesting thing is that there's today that we have the vaccine, we're seeing a very similar narrative about African American behavior. Every day, we're being inundated with stories about how African Americans are refusing the vaccine, once again, because they're afraid of Tuskegee. I get calls literally every single day. Emails flood my e-box from news outlets who want me to go on TV and radio and talk about the fact that African Americans are afraid of Tuskegee and therefore will not sign up for the vaccine. And I say I cannot do that because I'm not going to lie on television and radio. It's not at all Tuskegee. The reason why Tuskegee is promulgated as the reason for African American reticence is that unfortunately, even experts in the history of medicine tend not to know the history of African American treatment in medicine. Tuskegee is the only abusive study they know of. And so it's trotted out whenever they want to explain some sort of negative behavior in African Americans. But we know better. We know that it's not Tuskegee. We know that it's actually 4 centuries of abuse in the medical arena that makes African Americans logically wary of many types of healthcare. I document this fully in my book, Medical Apartheid. And since then, there have been other books focusing on 1 or 2 studies. The book about Henrietta Lacks, um, you know, draws a veil, lifts the veil on the mistreatment of African Americans. And yet, Tuskegee is what gets evoked consistently, even though Thomas LaVeist at Johns Hopkins did a series of studies showing that it's not Tuskegee, but 4 centuries of abuse. And the interesting thing is that he did one study in which it emerged that people who had never heard of Tuskegee, African Americans who had never heard of Tuskegee, were more likely to fear medical research. So it's not that one study. And why does it matter? Why does it matter that people are erroneously dragging out this one study to explain African American behavior? It matters because there's a big difference. If you say that African Americans are overreacting to a single study, then again, you're criticizing their behavior. There's something wrong with the way they think. They're being too fearful. Their fears don't have any logical basis. It's overreaction to one study. Whereas if you acknowledge that it's 4 centuries of abuse, now one has to admit that there's a logical basis for their fear. And what is the real reason, though, why African Americans are receiving the vaccine less frequently? The fact that they have the vaccine less frequency doesn't mean that they're avoiding it. It can also mean that they don't have equitable access. And indeed, we know this to be the case. We have policies in place that operate against African Americans accessing the vaccine. And one of them seems very logical and moral on the face of it. One of our policies is that we prioritize access to very elderly people over 85 years old, most of whom are in their 90s. And that makes sense on the face of it, right? Because we know that these are our elders. We want to protect them morally. They're frail, and they have higher risk. But so do African Americans have higher risk of having the disease and dying. And there are fewer old African Americans. In fact, African Americans are a young population. So are Native Americans, so are Hispanic Americans. The lower life expectancies in these groups, abetted by the poor health care that we get, means that we die younger and fewer of us live to join that high access group. In fact, if you look at people over 90 in this country, there are twice as many whites over 90 as there are African Americans over 90, if you look at the rates. So we have to change this policy. Yes, protect our elders, that's right, but also protect African Americans. Craft a policy that respects the vulnerability of elders without consigning African Americans to lesser access to the medication. And then the other thing we do in terms of policy is we tend to conflate risk and social status. We ought to assign the vaccine access by risk, but we also confuse it with social status. For example, we prioritize frontline healthcare workers, as we should. But that same prioritization should extend to people of color who work in hospitals and keep them clean and keep them going. The people who are cleaning the floor, feeding the patients, working in nutrition, having patient contact every day as clerks, they also share the risk of the healthcare providers, but they're not put into the high priority groups. So we are confusing a high social status and risk when it comes to devising policies. We must do better in terms of devising better policies that are fairer. And I mentioned originally about how the erosion of informed consent has, in some sense, started in developing world. And what's going on in developing world is actually on one level cruel and quite simple. Um, it's cheaper to do research in the developing world. It's cheaper to do high quality research there. The doctors and nurses and experts in the global south, places like Africa, most of Africa, as well as Thailand, Brazil, they will work at much lower rates than the doctors who work here. So when companies and medical centers want to test medications, they go to the global south for a testing that can be done much more quickly. And time is money when you're looking for FDA approval. You only have a few years. So being able to do it quickly is good. Being able to do it cheaply is good. Also, although I think few people will admit this, the truth is that even though these doctors are supposed to conform to US laws about conducting research, there's no oversight and it's easier to cut corners. In fact, just last year, we had two French doctors who spoke openly about taking ethically troubled medical research that would not be countenanced in France where they lived and wouldn't be accepted in this country. They said we should do it in Africa. We can do research on prostitutes. That's been done in the past. Basically, they were proposing going to Africa where you find people who are medically naive, who didn't have access to healthcare and would grasp at research straws. And when they openly said this, there was a lot of pearl clutching and outrage, as there should have been. But I've also read these sentiments in medical journals. I've been reading them for decades. I'm not saying there are a lot of articles saying this, but there shouldn't be one article saying this. And it is a mentality that existed before these two doctors began speaking. And there have been a series of abuses in the developing world. Pfizer, for example, tested an antibiotic during a meningitis epidemic, and there were lost consent forms. There was a falsified permission form from the Nigerian hospital. A lot of ethical violations, and children died. Children had horrible side effects like deafness. In the end, Pfizer paid a very large settlement, and all the case files were closed. So it was hard to find out what had exactly happened, but we know it was unethical and we know it was not good. And we often hear or read about a lot of the abuses in the developing world by US and Western doctors being dismissed as conspiracy theories. Oh, you don't believe that. That's some myth that we basically are um, being very disrespectful about these fears. We're saying that the people in the global south are believing negative things about Western doctors that everybody knows is not true, but they believe them simply because they're paranoid or because they're uneducated. The implication is they're not too smart. They believe anything. But I have made I've become sort of a mini expert in conspiracy theories. I've spoken at several conferences on them, one in England, one in Ireland. I've written for the Times about conspiracy theories. And one aspect that tends to be unacknowledged is that when people of color and powerless people have a belief that the healthcare system is unequal to, doesn't countenance, they often dismiss it as conspiracy theory. But they forget that you have both conspiracy theories and they're also real conspiracies. And sometimes 20 years intervenes between the time something is dismissed as a conspiracy theory and the time we discover that it was a real actual conspiracy. I can remember in 1975 when I first started researching the Tuskegee syphilis study that was conducted by the Public Health Service. I had doctors in the institution where I studied tell me that's a myth, that's an urban myth, that's conspiracy theory. And also, the Black Panthers and the Students for Democratic Society, these radical groups from the 70s, they also found the Tuskegee study and decried it, and also was dismissed like conspiracy theory. Now we know it actually happened. So things like the Watergate break-in, that was a real conspiracy. Conspiracies exist, and it's important to not dismiss things as a conspiracy theory simply because you don't want to believe it. Because sometimes truth can be stranger than fiction. I wrote a piece for the New York Times in 2007 documenting some of the doctors who have white and Western trained doctors who have gone to Africa and literally gotten away with murder. Um, One doctor, I believe from New York originally, who went to jail for killing 3 patients. He was basically a serial killer. He went to jail for killing the 3 American patients, but he's accused of killing 60 patients in Botswana and other countries in Africa. Never tried on those charges. Wouter Bassan, he was a high-ranking medical official in South Africa under apartheid, and he ran their biological and chemical weapons unit. And the stated purpose of the unit was to eliminate, kill the enemies of apartheid. And who are the enemies of apartheid? Black people. He did indeed kill many soldiers. They put poison T-shirts in the homelands. They plotted to kill Nelson Mandela, unsuccessfully, thank goodness. And their main project was to develop a contraceptive that would selectively sterilize Africans that could be given to them without their knowledge. They were going to call it a vaccine and give it to Black Africans to sterilize them. So these things have happened, and the problem is that, of course, we're talking about a small minority of doctors, but even a few doctors in a continent doing these kind of things and getting away with it will instill fear in countries even where they haven't practiced. So these things have happened, even though American media have not paid any attention to them. And so they feed the fears of people who, when they hear about vaccine programs, begin wondering, is this really a program to help me, or is some nefarious plot to harm me? Dismissing that fear out of hand is, first of all, it's illogical, it's inaccurate. It's a real fear. It needs to be addressed, but it's also very disrespectful to the people who hold it. And probably there's no better example of that than what our country did in 2013. It was discovered that the CIA mounted a sham polio vaccine campaign, pretending to vaccinate people against polio. I believe the particular vaccine required at least 2 doses, maybe 3. They only gave people 1 dose, so they weren't protected at all. But the point was not to protect them from polio. The point was to take DNA samples from the people they injected and see if they were relatives of Osama bin Laden. They were trying to find him at that point, and they did eventually find him. Once they did, they abandoned that fake polio vaccination campaign, and when people found out what had happened, there was a great deal of anger and distrust of vaccination programs. Many countries began banning polio vaccinations in the wake of this. 7 people trying to vaccinate people were killed, and the rates of polio rose in places like Nigeria. So these kind of events explain why people are distrustful of proffered vaccines and don't want to engage in trial. And they're not things that one can dismiss. They're things that we need to acknowledge and engage in. So I wrote a piece for Monde Afrique, which I talk about this pattern of white and Western doctors going to Africa, dispensing with informed consent, doing things that people aren't unaware of, not warning people what they're actually doing. For example, in Kano, Nigeria, Pfizer, testing experimental medication, did not tell people it was experimental. They set up their tent right next to Doctors Without Borders, who were giving out an approved, safe vaccine that had already been tested, standard of care. And the people who lived there could not really distinguish between who was Pfizer and who was Doctors Without Borders. So they were not getting informed consent. They thought they were getting an approved medication. And it's folly to think that people in this country don't know about this. The publications tend to publish information about that. There's some mainstream ones, wonderful ones like Democracy Now!, but there's also The Final Call, Muslim population. So people are well aware this is happening in the developing world. They know it's happening to people of color, and it feeds logical fears about how they are going to be treated here in this country. I want to give you an example of one of the things that happens when people, when doctors use a blame the victim model to talk about disease rates. This happened in Ebola in 2014 during the outbreak. I was really dismayed to find out that all these doctors and ethicists were explaining why, even though we had a new medication, ZMapp, it should not be given to Africans. A lot of reasons were given. None of them were even, faintly logical or ethical. But things were said. First of all, they evoked Tuskegee. They said, well, these people in Africa, like people in the US, they're afraid of medical research, they're afraid of they wouldn't take it anyway. There's no point in wasting the medication on them because they won't take it anyway. Which reminded me that during the Tuskegee study, researchers used the supposed fear to explain why they weren't going to give any medication to the men that had syphilis. They said, oh, after these Black Americans are afraid of medicine, they don't trust us anyway, they wouldn't take it. There was no point in even giving them the medication. That's exactly what was echoed in 2014 in Ebola. And I was finding myself in the dismaying position of being the only person I knew who was saying, of course we need to give these people the medication. One white Western healthcare worker from the US, Keith Brantley, was given ZMapp. He recovered, came back to the US, and then said, no, you can't give it to Africans. He said, I'm a doctor, I'm a scientist, I can understand informed consent. Those Africans cannot understand informed consent. So they're tapping into the fictitious belief that Africans are less intelligent and that they will reject all medication. Even Sheikh Umar Khan, who was a chief virologist in Sierra Leone, he was an expert in Ebola who'd been treating people long before the Westerners arrived. When ZMapp became available, no one told him he wasn't given it and he died. And I actually had quite the debate on CNN about why I think the the people in Africa should receive the medication.
Harriet, there's no sound.
Oh, thanks for letting me know. So the gist was they were proffering the arguments I gave often. We can't give people in the developing world, and we tested it in monkeys. Now we're going to test it in people. In Black people. Now they're going to say that's racist. And I explained that the real problem was that very often testing in the developing world involved not giving people informed consent, not letting them know what was being done, not letting them know that what they were taking was actually an experimental therapeutic. And that was the real ethical issue, which seemed to be completely ignored by people arguing during that Ebola outbreak that Africans should not receive the medication. So during the pandemic, emergencies like pandemics and warfare tend to escalate the erosion of informed consent. Informed consent, that kind of, cutting of corners, is more frequent because there's urgency, because there's fear about having a dearth of resources, too few resources, too little manpower, woman power, too few medications. People go into this emergency mode, and begin cutting corners. They feeling they don't have the time to do informed consent, or that it simply will not jive well with their mission, which is to make sure people receive vaccines or to make sure people get basic care. So informed consent is something that is exacerbated during emergency situations, exactly like the one that we find ourselves in. And as a result, we have had a lot of cases where people have been either had treatment withheld from them without anyone explaining to them that this is the case, or been forced to take drugs that were presented to them as approved drugs that were actually experimental. But before that, all that happened in 2007, we had artificial blood that was tested. A private company, Northfield Laboratories, wanted to test artificial blood and the military was behind it because artificial blood would be a great thing for soldiers. If it worked well and it was safe, soldiers who found themselves in the field and might be hours or days away from formal medical care could be kept alive by artificial blood. But for people living in cities and suburbs, the vast majority of us, for civilians, artificial blood didn't really present any benefit, even if it worked. In this country, almost everybody is no more than 20 minutes away from an emergency department, emergency care. And during that 20 minutes, saline, salt water, which is what's the standard of care, will keep you out of shock and alive to get to the hospital as well as blood will. So ambulances give people saline. It works perfectly well, no advantage to artificial blood, and yet it wasn't tested on soldiers. It was tested on civilians who it wouldn't help. The civilians were not told they were given artificial blood. If you were a trauma victim, the ambulance would pull up, and before they started to treat you, no matter whether you had a heart attack, a gunshot wound, or had a stroke, they would open a manila envelope and read a computer printout that told them whether to give you the standard of care or the artificial blood called polyheme. And then they would do as the printout said. Then they take you to the hospital where blood is available, but they wouldn't give you blood. They would keep giving you the artificial blood for 12 hours. This actually violates the law. The law says you can only give people an unapproved therapeutic when there's nothing better available. And blood is better, and blood was available, but that's how they conduct the study. 720 people in 26 medical centers around the country and Canada were drawn into the study, never told they were in the study. Some of them died, of course, without ever knowing they were in a research study, and some of them lived, and I had a chance to speak with one of them at length. Her name was Martha Millette, and she told me that when the ambulance came to her house and picked her up, she was unconscious, but she woke up in the ambulance in time to see them giving her this therapeutic. So she didn't know what it was. She thought it was blood. But when she got to the hospital, her daughter had found out that she had been in the trial, and her daughter told her. No medical personnel ever told her that she was enrolled in this trial of artificial blood. And so it was a very troubling situation because he's repeated all across the country and in Canada. And finally, the publicity, what people were told about this was not that we're trying this new artificial blood that if it's successful will make a lot of money from Northfield Laboratories. No, people were told we've got this new cutting edge treatment for people, and you're lucky you live in this area because if you are sick, this is what you will get. So they were lied to. It's not a treatment. It's an artificial experimental substance. And the language can be very important here. People, when they talked about this, they talked about giving it to patients to treat them. The people they're giving it to were not patients. The research subjects, there's a big difference. If you are a patient, the focus is on you. The focus is on maximizing your wellness, your health, your chance of survival. If you're a research subject, the focus is not on you. The focus is on the successful study. Now, researchers, not to say researchers are cold-hearted or cruel, but, if they can devise a study in such a way that it will help you, they will. But that is not the focus. The focus is on conducting the study, and conducting the study sometimes means doing things that might actually run counter to your best, to your own health. So being a subject and being a patient are very different. You have rights as a patient that you don't have as a research subject. And yet this company consistently referred to these people as patients. In fact, it actually worked against them in North Carolina, where they called the subjects patients because a lawyer pointed out that, wait a minute, conducting this study where you're not telling people that you're involving them in research, that violates the North Carolina Patient Bill of Rights. And they actually suspended the study there for a while, but eventually they got a waiver that allowed them to continue it. There's also confusion around, semantic confusion around the word consent. When we think about consent, giving permission for something, you don't need a dictionary to know that consent is something that has to be elicited from you before someone proceeds. You can't do something to someone and then afterwards say, oh, do you agree to this? Can I get your consent? It's too late. You've already done it. And yet this terminology does exactly that. A lot of the terminology that's used is confusing. The word consent is in the term, but there's no consent associated with it. Presumed consent, for example, means that we're conducting a research study and we presume that if we asked you to be in it, you would say yes. So we're going to place you in it without asking you. If that makes no sense to you, I can't help you because it makes no sense to me either, but it's used. It's used in order to get around getting people's consent. And then community consent is terminology that was used in these settings like artificial blood, where instead of asking individuals permission, the company and the researchers decided to just tell people in the area what they were doing. The idea being if people know about it, then, they have some protection and they can actually try to opt out. And they had to provide a way of people opting out. So they said, if you don't want to be in the study, you can obtain these plastic bracelets that you have to wear 7 days a week, 365 days a year. You have to wear them all the time. And they say things like, I decline the polyheme study. So the idea is if you're wearing a bracelet like that, they won't put you in the study. But what's the catch of that? Clearly, you have to know the study is taking place. And in my book, I document how in these communities where they've done this kind of research, they have not done a good job of telling the community that this is taking place. In North Carolina, Durham, North Carolina, they had like 8 million people in the area. They only had like 500 people who seem to have been informed by that. So it's a failure on many, many fronts, a failure to actually offer any kind of consent, and then a failure to be honest about the fact they were pretending that they were offering consent by using terminology that had nothing to do with consent. So during the pandemic, some of the things that happened were when people were seemed to be agitated. Say someone calls the police, calls the ambulance because they have someone who's either ill or someone who is acting out, and the ambulance attendants decide, that person seems really agitated. They actually had like a check sheet, and if the person were agitated enough, they would give them the drug ketamine. They didn't tell them they were giving it to them. They didn't ask their permission, but experimentally, they'd administer ketamine. In cities like Minneapolis, there were complaints by ambulance attendants and other people that the police were actually urging or coercing the attendants to give ketamine to people. And ketamine is a very potent drug. Many people who are given ketamine develop breathing problems and have to go on ventilators. Not at all unusual to be ambulance comes to your house, maybe by the police urging, maybe not at the police urging, but you're given ketamine. Then you have to be put on a ventilator. You wake up in the hospital the next day on a ventilator. But next to your hospital bed is a form. And that form is a permission form. It basically says, you've been enrolled in the ketamine study, but if you don't want to be in the study, just sign the form and we'll take you out. How can they remove someone from the study when they've already given them ketamine? Well, what they're actually doing is saying to the person, if you don't want to be in the study, sign the form, we will not use your data. But as Carl Elliott pointed out to me, people don't object to their data being used. They object to waking up in the hospital on a ventilator. So This kind of thing that's happening, very nightmare scenario. It's happening in Minneapolis. It's happening in cities in Colorado. It's happening across the country. And you may have heard of Elijah McCain, the young man who died after being stopped by police who called the ambulance. They gave him ketamine and he died before the next day. So he died in a research study that he never knew that he was in. So these are frankly murderous policies, but they're becoming more and more common. And here's Michael Hickson, who fell ill with COVID-19, became quite ill, ended up in the ICU, but recovered. So he recovered, he was doing quite well, but his wife got a phone call from the hospital where the doctor said, your husband's recovering from COVID-19, but we're putting him in hospice care. And she was confused. Well, why is he going into hospice if he's doing well? And the doctor began talking about the fact that her husband was confined to a wheelchair, he was quadriplegic, and basically said, according to her, that he had no quality of life. So they were going to withhold medication, food, and water. And she says, he's in a wheelchair, so he's no quality of life. And the doctor says, that's correct. And indeed, they withheld food, water, and medicine, and he died 6 days later. During the pandemic, when hospitals have become closed institutions and we can't go to see our loved ones in the hospital and can't monitor what's happening, many people are fearful about events like this. His wife has said she's going to sue. And the question is, how often is this happening? And invoking quality of life is very frightening. It's very eugenic. Remember that Susan Moore, an internist, complained of the same thing, complained of being inappropriately treated before she died of COVID-19. I hear daily from many people making the same accusation. Most of them are not physicians, however. So we're left to wonder how often this is happening and how it's being described in hospital records. Will that permit us to track it? We just don't know. This whole mentality of suspension of treatment, of suspension of, of normal treatment is certainly abetting our fears of being inveigled in research without our permission. I had written some pieces about how common it had become, in terms of illegal, research that violates the law. But the problem we're facing today is that it's perfectly legal. The polyheme, I've already talked about the artificial blood that was legally given in all those studies. At the end, when the data was analyzed from the polyheme study, after all the glowing descriptions of how artificial blood was going to be a great boon to mankind, etc., it turned out that people who got the artificial blood had a higher rate of heart attacks and deaths than people who got the standard of care. So again, turned out to be not safe, not effective, and people died in the study who never knew they were in a research study. There have been many others. I counted 25. I'm sure there's some I missed. And they include things like, I'll talk in more detail about them. But I need to point out that these are legal. There are two laws passed in 1996 that made it legal to test medications and frankly anything on trauma victims without asking their permission. There also was a waiver passed that year that said that you can waive getting consent if you're testing something that has quote unquote more than minimal risk. That language is so vague, I don't know what it means. Who is to establish what's a minimal risk? And by the way, if you're doing research, you don't know everything about the risk. You don't know what the risks are. I find that quite Kafkaesque. So these two laws have catalyzed an explosion in research without getting people's permission. And the polyheme study, among other things, targeted minority cities and towns. That means they had very unusual demographics. It was more often conducted in areas in cities and towns that had more minority group people than white people. And then too, even in areas where there were more whites than blacks, there were policies that meant that more people who were people of color were tested. For example, in Los Angeles, they only put it on the ambulances that served the Black and Hispanic areas of town. So even though this is a risk for everybody, people of color were the ones who suffered the most, who are more likely to be inveigled into this non-consensual research. In 2008, April 28th, JAMA published an article looking at all types of artificial blood, looking at 10 types of this artificial blood, and they found that in every single case, people who got them were more likely to have heart attacks and to die. So it's very consistent, and yet more and more studies kept being done. And here's data from Northfield Laboratories' own testing, showing that if you look at the figure in Caucasian, 47%. Most of the people tested were people of color. The military they've also been victims of this. A waiver by President Bill Clinton permitted the military to test soldiers with anthrax vaccine. Now, the anthrax vaccine was described as FDA approved, but that wasn't quite true. It was approved only for cutaneous anthrax, anthrax on the skin, which is not as dangerous as the inhalation anthrax these soldiers were facing. Inhalation anthrax has a very high death and disability rate. Cutaneous anthrax, if it's treated, you're almost certain to recover. So they were lied to about whether it was actually had been approved. And it was given to soldiers who were going to be assigned to countries where anthrax was endemic, ostensibly to protect them. But in reality, the Bioport vaccine that was given to them had a lot of problems. From the very beginning, many soldiers got sick, some died, and many soldiers tried to reject the shots, to say, I don't want to have these shots. When they did, they were punished severely. They were put in the brig. They suffered dishonorable discharges. They went to jail. They were stripped of all their titles, stripped of all the money they had earned. The penalties were really severe. I write about one woman named Jamaica Barber, who was a private in the Army, who decided she didn't want the shot because she and her husband wanted a family, and there weren't any testing or guarantees that it would be safe for pregnant women. And she didn't want a confrontation with the Army, so she decided to ask for a reassignment to a unit where she would not have to take the shot. If you're not going to an area where there's anthrax, then you don't need it. But she said her commanding officer wanted to make an example of her and blocked her reassignment. And so she refused to take the shot. The commanding officer punished her by making her stay in a barracks where she was the only person there, sign in twice a day. She's basically, being punished, like going to the brig. And she described how he'd bring other soldiers to the barracks and they would harass her, push her, yell at her, try to bully her into taking the shot, but she wouldn't do it. She says, as I describe in the book, that after she'd been in this barracks by herself for weeks, she jumped out of a second floor window and went AWOL. She did it, she said, because she learned she was being confined to a barracks where there had been a gang rape 2 weeks earlier. So she escaped. Eventually, she was thrown out of the Army with a less than honorable discharge, but fortunately, after a decade of fighting it legally, she finally got her honorable discharge. But she is only one of many, many soldiers who were punished for refusing the shot, and then other soldiers were crippled and injured severely by the anthrax shots. These included military personnel who were doctors and nurses, who also complained about having had accepted the shot and then becoming very ill, or about rejecting the shot and then being punished severely by the Army. In the end, a study that was done showed that many people left the armed forces during this time, many more than would normally leave in that time period because of these shots. And they said that they thought that there was a lowering of people signing up for the Army and other armed forces because they wanted to avoid the shot. So it was, in the end, it turned out, of course, the shots were harmful, but there was more going on than that. It became truly strange. At the same time this was happening to soldiers in the armed forces, we were having a crisis among civilians Remember the anthrax that was being mailed to politicians and movie stations and going to the post office? People were sickening and dying from anthrax that was being mailed around the country. Well, 5 people died by the end. Many people were sickened by it. There was a lot of fear about this anthrax terrorism on U.S. soil. And in the end, the person that FBI found was responsible was this man, Bruce Ivins. He was a high-ranking biodefense scientist who actually had designed the anthrax vaccine. He was upset because he was afraid the anthrax vaccine was going to be withdrawn from testing. And he wanted people to understand that it was important to have an anthrax vaccine. And he did that by sending it around the country and poisoning people, making them fearful, making them supportive of the vaccine. That's something worthy of a science fiction movie. And yet the FBI was quite adamant that this is exactly what happened. Today, I've already mentioned Elijah McCain's death from ketamine. In Minneapolis, this is one of the many people who have been given ketamine by the police or by the ambulance attendants against their will and have been harmed by it. We know that ketamine is a dangerous drug. It has been linked to high suicide rates. It's also, its original use was as a horse tranquilizer. It's been used in surgery, but only under very strict, medical um, observation. And now you've got ambulance attendants injecting people who they decide are a little too agitated. It's a prescription for disaster. And there have been 4 separate studies conducted of ketamine. Why is this being done? I submit it has to do with money. Ketamine, the potential of ketamine to be marketed is very high. If you could find large groups of people who would be good, not good, but who would become a market for ketamine. If you could okay it, for example, for some psychiatric problems, if you could okay it for use in the military, they could sell a great deal of ketamine. It's patented and it'd be very lucrative. And I think that's the main impetus behind it. Money is often important impetus in testing drugs without permission, because even though conflicts of interest are something that we should be very vigilant about, too many researchers have a financial interest in the outcome of the studies they're doing. This is Elijah McCain, who I'm sure you're familiar with from the headlines, died after being given ketamine. Here's a good example of a research study that could prove quite lucrative to the person conducting it. Hypothermia is something that's familiar to a lot of us, especially people living in cold climates. Hypothermia is actually a deadly disorder. If you are exposed to cold for a long time and your core temperature falls below a certain level, you're very likely to die. It's extremely dangerous. Even if you get a prompt attention in a level 1 hospital emergency department fully equipped, you still may not survive. In fact, most people don't survive. Only 5% of people who suffer profound hypothermia are able to survive after intensive care. And yet, in Baltimore, there's a research team headed by Samuel Tischerman that wants to that is inducing hypothermia intentionally. The New Yorker article I read about this spoke of young Black men as good subjects. Their rationale was, well, young Black men who have gunshot wounds, they're very likely to have gunshot wounds, and we're focusing on that kind of injury here. So young Black men with gunshot wounds might benefit from this. Very unlikely. Very unlikely. There isn't any proof. There aren't examples. Not one person has been documented to be helped by this therapy. It's frankly counterintuitive. Hypothermia is something that we try to avoid, not something we try to induce. And when I read the original description of the protocol, it talks very vaguely about how it's true. Some toddlers have survived drowning situations that people feared they would die in, and they theorize it's because they were in very cold water and it depressed their metabolism long enough. That may be true. It's true of those toddlers. Doesn't mean it's going to be true of an adult. And why are you focused on Black men? The very vague language about, well, they're likely to have a high rate of gunshot wounds, that doesn't stand up to scrutiny. I immediately began looking at the rates of gunshot wound deaths in 2016 and immediately found that white men, 9,000 white men died from gunshot wounds in 2016, but only 6,000 Black men. So if suffering a gunshot wound were indeed an indication for this, it would be white men, not Black men. And the New Yorker article, for example, describes how the only people who who at the meeting where they described this complained about this and said they would never be in something like that were two young Black men were there. But description of that is very disrespectful. They're writing off in like a very jocular way. Deeply troubling. The racial element, the racial targeting, the idea that you're going to take something that is known as the triad of death in emergency departments and induce it in people. And you haven't produced a single person who's been helped by that. Also, in 2016, the team said they would have a medical report on their progress in 2 years. There's never been such a report. I called Dr. Tischerman repeatedly. I emailed him. I called the press office. I did get to talk to the press officer who gave me some information, but Tischerman would not speak with me. But he did speak to New Scientist magazine, where he described his study kind of bewilderingly as suspended animation. It's not suspended animation. Suspended animation implies that you're taking someone into a state that you can reverse, you can bring back. There's no proof you can bring people back from hypothermia once you've induced it. Most of the people who die. So it's troubling on every issue, but the thing that bothered me the most was when I began reading the original description of the study was Dr. Tischerman has a financial interest in intellectual property for the development of the emergency preservation procedure. Other words, if he's successful, he will make money. And so there's a conflict of interest that frankly, I cannot understand why he's allowed to proceed with a conflict of interest like that. Having a financial interest in the outcome of a study obviously distorts one's ability to be objective about it. So it's been shown that studies tend to find results in line with the financial interests of the people who fund it. So this is really verboten, and yet it's being carried out right now. And yet Dr. Kisherman, he won't speak with me. I don't know who he is willing to speak with, but very often researchers I found who are conducting ethically troubled research will not speak to people who they suspect are not going to write puff pieces. You tend to read a lot of positive things about their studies, very Pollyanna-ish descriptions about all the great things it might do for people that kind of ignore the death rates. But then when someone calls who sounds like me, who sounds like they might be more critical, they simply, omerta, they don't want to speak with you. So I think that really is a big problem because it tends to increase the ability to veil these studies. The reason why people don't know about these studies and the dangers of them is that researchers are able to successfully avoid negative, hard questions. And the late Jay Katz said something really important about this trend toward ignoring informed consent. He said, the problem, like I mentioned before, is very often it's described as some kind of wonderful cutting edge treatment we're going to give you. Katz said that's a therapeutic illusion. You're encouraging subjects of research to think of themselves as patients, and they're not. He said research, not treatment. Whenever clear distinctions are not made between the two, the waiver of informed consent becomes problematic because some human subjects are being recruited to serve the ends of others. And that's true. Had polyheme, the artificial blood, for example, if it had been approved, if it had been found efficacious, one difficulty with it is that the people who assume the risks would have been the people of color who were targeted in studies. The people who enjoy the benefits would be other people, including many white people who could afford polyheme, which would certainly have been more expensive than blood. So you have this, ethicists called it violates distributive justice, which simply means that It's not ethical, or it's not right to have one group of people suffer all the risks of research, another group of people enjoy all the benefits. The Research Outcomes Consortium is like this confederation of research projects united by their refusal to offer informed consent. No subjects in these programs know that they're subjects. No one's been asked permission, and they do a variety of things, a wide variety of things. I can't go into detail about all of them, but they've tested things like a patented valve, a valve that's supposed to help you with do CPR. I don't know which valve this is, but there was another valve I describe in the book, very similar idea, that was touted as an improvement, something that would benefit people. It was tested. When it was tested, it was found to contribute to people's deaths rather than keep them alive. And the people, again, had not been informed. They were in the study, didn't have a chance to say yes or no to it. It's tested things like very concentrated saline solution, which I find bizarre. We know that that's dangerous, but it was being tested as a possible treatment for trauma. The test was eventually suspended, though. They tested heated saline, infusing hot salt water in people's blood. Also quite troubling. These are things that, frankly, I cannot imagine people agreeing to, which is perhaps why they're only being tested on people who don't have the chance to say yes or no. It's worth pointing out that in Seattle, when they were testing artificial blood, they were doing so pretty widely, and usually these people conducting these studies do a pretty good job of only having news accounts that are very positive, very unrealistic, successfully touting this as some, cutting edge, beneficial therapy that you are lucky enough to have access to. But in Seattle, somebody wrote an article that was a little bit more sanguine and talked about risks, benefits, ethical problems of consent, and immediately the research group was flooded with requests for bracelets. People in Seattle wanted those plastic bracelets so they could get out of the study. Well, the team said they ran out of bracelets. They said they ran out of bracelets for 1 year, which it completely obliterated people's chance to get out of the study. And now the language around the bracelets has changed. Earlier, around 2006, the language said that if you wear the bracelet, that's an indication to researchers you don't want to be in the study. They won't use you. Now they say if you wear the bracelet, we'll make every effort not to use you. But when I talked to the principal investigator, he stopped short. He would not guarantee that people wearing bracelets would not be used in the study. So there's no guarantee. There's no foolproof way to opt out. I want to say a word too about words, semantics. I already talked about the fact that a lot of the phrases that use informed consent or use consent really do not offer consent. That's very misleading. But there's a lot of other censor going on too. One of the things I noticed quite a while ago was that I would give lectures around the country, and sometimes when I would use the term medical experimentation, there would be a scholar in the audience who would say, "You shouldn't use that term. It's it's stigmatizing. That's very alarmist. Don't say medical experimentation." I'm like, why not? That's exactly what it is. But what's happened is that the many people in the research arena don't want to say medical experimentation because everyday lay people react negatively to it. Some people in lay people feel like medical experimentation means I'm going to be in danger. So they like to use research studies, clinical trials, things that sound much more innocuous. But medical experimentation is accurate and it's appropriate. And if you look at the literature of scholars, you find that many of them use it. When they're talking to each other, they use the term. But when they're talking to us, they want to shy away from it. There's also the use of tossing around terms that are stigmatizing, like paranoia. Describing people's fears of paranoia is not only disrespectful, it's wrong. It's not paranoia if it's a real, actual fear. It's not paranoia if it's a real, actual risk of being forced into medical research. So that language should be abandoned. Also, you often, if you bring up a troubled medical experiment, you'll often get a response about, oh yes, the past abuses have been terrible. I didn't say past. I'm talking about what happened today. You know, if you say past abuses automatically in response to abuses, then you're basically communicating your thought that um, there's no basis for fear today. But there is. There are abuses now. And one shouldn't use language to try to elide the fact that there are continuing ongoing abuses. Of course, we talked about conspiracy theory already. We have to remember that conspiracy theory is a label that's not always accurate, and that there are conspiracies as well as conspiracy theory. But then there are things too, a little more subtle, like study acronyms. You know, jargon itself is very problematic when discussing medical research because researchers have their own language jargon, very useful for talking to each other in shorthand, but when they're talking to lay people, it can actually militate against lay people understanding what's going on. I'm not saying they're doing that intentionally, but it's the nature of jargon to not only include experts, but to exclude lay people. So there are certain terms in research like randomization, which we know what it means to do something randomly, but lay people don't always understand that if you're randomized, or your trial has been randomized, it's a computer and not a medical profession who's decided who goes into what study. And also terms like coercion. In medical ethics, I was a bit surprised to find out that coercion is defined so narrowly that it's hard to say that anybody has been coerced unless you're talking about holding a gun to their head, you know? But the truth is, it's quite, you know, easy to coerce a subject. You know, subjects who are considering medical research because they're very ill, for example. If you have terminal cancer, then you don't have to hold a gun to that person's head to make them so fearful they'll go along with almost anything. If you were to imply that a particular study might be the only thing standing between them and their death, well, you know, that's inciting a lot of fear. So the shying away from using the word coercion, even when it applies, is a bit of a problem. Even the acronyms that researchers are so fond of and companies love, they can be trouble too, because some of the acronyms are things like miracle or cure. And one researcher said, is a big problem. We shouldn't be using these upbeat acronyms to describe studies. These are studies where we don't know what the outcome will be. We hope it'll be a good outcome. It could be a bad outcome, but we're telling people who are desperately ill, join the miracle study, join the hope study, join the cure study. And they said, we wouldn't get away with saying we had a surefire cure for cancer. We shouldn't get away with saying we've got this miracle study that you need to join. So these things are things that don't get a lot of attention, but they're cumulative, they're very important. They're very important in describing research because they can impede communicating information in the kind of way that's going to be accurate and fair and balanced and really impart to the subject what they need to know. It can actually impede communication. So thank you so much for listening to me, and I'm very much looking forward to engaging your questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Harriet, for that presentation. Provocative, stimulating, and highly informative. And I want to remind our audience that you can get her book, Carte Blanche, The Erosion of Medical Consent, um, at our online bookshop. It's right there in front of you. And we are offering to viewers in the audience today a 10% discount. We really encourage you get this book. So I wanted to have a little exchange with you, Harriet, and then we have some questions from the audience that we'll bring in. Um, First thing I wanted to say was, I think a lot of what you're, pointing to, is just an indictment of this whole medical system. And as I said at the outset, um, we have this very, very dire situation right now where there is that whole legacy of the use and abuse of Black bodies by the medical system under this system of capitalism, imperialism, and as you emphasize, the continuing abuse of Black bodies and Black lives. And very important, this is not something from the past. This is something that continues in different forms. And I did want to, emphasize here that what we're really talking about is a system that is an utter failure on every dimension. I mean, dealing with, we've lived through these emergencies, these crises, AIDS, Katrina, and now COVID. I mean, we had a president of the United States, Trump, who denied, that there was even this, this virus, and was blocking, as you point out in your book, even the use of evidence-based they were actually banning language of science as part of their denialism of the reality of this COVID pandemic and the need for science to be applied to solving it. So it's the points that you're making are extremely important vis-a-vis how this system functions and operates, and especially the focus of your book, being the question of medical experimentation and all the ways it's conducted, which is driven. And here, you mentioned conflicts of interest, for instance, and there's statistics in your book about researchers getting $10,000 or $20,000 per so-called volunteer in a medical trial. But it goes, that is very true, but it goes even deeper than that. And that is that this whole medical system, whether we're talking about the pharmaceutical companies, the hospitals, and how they're structured, this is all driven and governed by profit, and that is the capitalist imperialist system. And if you look at, even the vaccine, right? And I want to come to this point a little later, but the vaccine now, the COVID vaccine, this is protected by intellectual property rights. And there was Pfizer and Moderna. These companies have received funds to do that research, and they are privatizing, the benefits of that research. And it's actually limiting the ability of people to get the vaccine because it's protected by patents. And I'm speaking to this because we did get a question from someone about patents that prevent access to needed medicine, and the data that's covered about the harmful effects of medicine. This is all bound up with the very nature and functioning of a system based on profit. And embedded in it is white supremacy and racism. From everything you've documented in your work about the use and abuse of Black bodies, to the fact that there are only 5% of the physicians in the United States are African American. And we can go through the specialties and the ways in which resources are allocated to different communities, and how the oppressed communities are locked out of the needed health care, the inequities that you're speaking about. So I really want to emphasize here that we're really talking about a whole system that is driven and governed by profit, and that functions in these ways. And not only does it use the third world, the people of the third world, as a testing ground for these clinical trials without any protections, but you have, in the midst of this pandemic, the hoarding, the functional hoarding of the vaccine by the rich capitalist and imperialist countries, the US, at the front of the line. So I did want to start by really sort of emphasizing that there is a deep cause for this, and it's reflected in the whole history of the practice of medicine in this country, and the ways in which this system is not only unable to meet the needs of people, but the obstacle to actually confronting these crises, like this pandemic, on the level, on the scale, and with the urgency, that's required. And it takes forms of, what's happening in the prisons. We had a special program on COVID in the prisons. It takes the form of what's happening in the immigration concentration camps on the border. This whole system, has no respect for human life. And as I said, The bottom line is the bottom line of profit. And, it reflects, not just, the economic nature of this system, but it's also embodied in the very ways in which these institutions of medicine practice medicine, the relations, as you point out, between experimenter and the experimented upon, doctor and patient. And this has to be utterly and radically transformed. So I just want to, and that's what we at Revolution Books bring forward here, that there is a revolutionary way out, a solution. And I want to, in the interest of, again, bringing to people's attention important work, the Constitution for the New Socialist Republic in North America, written by Bob Avakian, is the vision and the blueprint for a society in which profits are not determining, in which social need is what sets the terms for how the healthcare system will function, in which the goal of the healthcare system is to meet the all-round health and well-being of the population, in which research is being conducted to the possibility and anticipation of crises like pandemics, where preparations, rational preparations, can be made, in which you are transforming the actual relations between medicine practiced by experts and the masses of people, that you bring the communities, you bring those who are impacted into the whole process of discovery and the sharing of knowledge. And intellectual property rights, no more. Pharmaceutical companies, privately owned, with their metrics, no more. The resources of society, medical, intellectual, scientific, are being deployed for the betterment of humanity. And it's a science, it's a medicine that will serve the people. So I just want to put that before the audience, that everything that you're pointing to, is getting at the fact that this system is completely incapable of meeting the basic health needs of the people. And now, with the world being so interconnected, these crises are interconnected. What happens, in other parts of the world, what happens in the US, and this Constitution, by the way, in terms of intellectual property rights, no more. The knowledge shared with the people of the world, cooperative, collective efforts to go to work. This is how dire and how desperate things are. And I just want to, bring that right away, because we are now, as I said, at this very critical juncture where it's a system that's incapable of meeting these basic needs. But we have this pandemic, and there is the COVID vaccine, and there is the need right now to get that to people. It is safe and efficacious. And I just wanted, to emphasize these points, because the lives that are on the line now, and what, long-term damage, will result from COVID. You yourself have written about, the cognitive effects of different, environmental factors and viruses, et cetera. We don't even know what the longer term effects this will have. So I want to, make this point in opening. The next point I want to say is, I have to, ask you, on the question of conspiracy theory. There are conspiracies, and then there's conspiracy theory, as you said. And it's the case that Louis Farrakhan, the Nation of Islam, and the Final Call, I just have to be very blunt about this. They have been telling people, don't get the vaccine. And they are spreading bogus conspiracy theory, which is very damaging and very harmful. And I can't let that go unremarked upon. Okay.
Such as?
Yeah.
Give us an example.
In the Final Call, they have said that people.
No, but tell me one of those conspiracy theories. So I know what you're talking about.
I'm saying that they are arguing that people should not get the vaccine.
Right, but you said that
Why are they arguing that?
You said they're promulgating conspiracy theories. I'd like to know which ones they are.
They have
I don't know of those.
The pale, and there was the rider on the pale horse. This is all I'm saying. They are actually, tell people, go to revcom.us. There is an article last week on the final call and what it is saying about the COVID vaccine and what it's saying about COVID. I am simply stating that I agree with your point that there are actual, phenomena. The CIA in Pakistan, with the polio vaccine. Someone has written in a question about missionaries in Uganda pretending to be doctors. These are the kind of phenomena that have to be called out and condemned. But then there are the harmful ways in which people are being exposed to disinformation and misinformation about this. So in any case, I just wanted to bring those points, into the discussion. And I wanted to have you comment, one, on, the nature of the larger character of this healthcare system in the context of the system that we live under. And then someone asked in the question about trustworthiness of medicine under the conditions that you've described. So how do you see the relationship between sort of the economics of this system and the question of trustworthiness? And you make proposals at the end of your book about how to change, some of these practices. But can you actually create a needs-based egalitarian healthcare structure in a system that is based on and driven by the mandates of profit? So these are some points both that I'm making and that are coming in from the audience, especially, this point about trustworthiness. And someone has also asked about the forced vaccine testings in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, why don't we take them one at a time? Those are a lot of great questions, but they're very broad and there are lots of them. So let me take them one at a time.
Right, because I thought it'd be put a lot here for you to systematize and walk through. And there's a few other questions coming in that I'll put before you.
I actually wrote a book about the economics of medical research and healthcare and how it has changed dramatically since 1980. In 1980, there were several laws passed that facilitated the transfer of intellectual property from universities to corporations. Before 1980, medical research was essentially driven by healthcare and university institutions, and they were tied very closely, attuned to the needs of lay people, what lay people wanted. When we had polio endemic in this country, everyone, of course, wanted a polio vaccine. And healthcare workers and universities were focused on needs like that. But when corporations began taking medical discoveries and molecules and patenting them and then selling them, they imposed their own, hierarchies of need, which were focused not on public goods, but rather on maximizing profits. In the name of maximizing profits, intellectual property has been assiduously profited from, pursued, and now we have problems like developing drugs that will be blockbuster drugs and make $1 billion a year and have very wide markets rather than drugs that for needed diseases. So that's why we now have 20 drugs for erectile dysfunction and nothing new for malaria. So the agenda is being set by profit-making corporations. And we live in a capitalist country. No matter how one feels about that, it's a fact. So the thing is, when companies use profits to measure their success in the medical arena, the problem is that we can't expect the companies to care about us. We can't expect the companies to sublimate and make less money because they care about our health. Their behavior's already shown us they don't care about our health. But our government, our people that we pay, and that we should expect to care about our health and should defend us. So our government should be reining in these companies. Our government should be forcing them to develop things that will fit the public needs, and it is not. In terms of intellectual property, countries like Thailand and Brazil have done a very good job in the past of circumventing patents, Western patents, and using expertise in India, for example, to generate cheap versions of needed drugs, AIDS drugs that people can actually afford, for example. And when they have done these wonderful things, our government's reaction has been to accuse them of intellectual property theft. The WTO has forced poor developing countries to buy into Western forms of drugs and honor Western patents, which they can't afford to do. And instead of helping them, our country has responded by, again, invoking intellectual property theft when they try to develop cheaper versions of drugs. So we clearly have a healthcare system that's beholden to corporate interests when it's not actually synonymous with corporate interests, and a government that has refused to use remedies that exist. You know, there are remedies already in place. We don't need new policies. For example, patents. If you have a patented drug and you're charging $1 million a year for it as that's a price tag on some cancer drugs. People can't afford it. The government has the right by law to seize that patent, give it to somebody who will produce it cheaply so people can afford it, and pay the original patent holder some fee to go away. But our government won't do that. They won't do it for drugs. They did it for DirecTV, though. They do it for other things, I think, but they won't do it for drugs. So unfortunately, we don't really need new policies when it comes to that. We need to enact the ones that we have. We need a government that is actually going to look out for our interests. And of course, in my opinion, what would be really ideal, it would be to revoke that Bayh-Dole Act. We need to dismantle medical innovation and development and distribution from corporate, control. As long as corporations control it, it'll always be too expensive. It'll always be misplaced in agenda with focusing on the bottom line rather than health. So I think we need a real change of heart here and a change of system. Trustworthiness is really important. I talk about this often in context with the propensity for us to examine African Americans' behavior when there's an illness that is affecting us disproportionately, typically because of the healthcare system inequity. What we do is we'll say that African Americans are too reluctant to accept, medications, vaccines, clinical trials, and that's why they're so sick. African Americans are failing to do X or Y, but it's not, you can't scrutinize African American behaviors. The real problem with the healthcare system is the system itself. It is an untrustworthy system. It's been that way for African Americans since our advent here. It's been that way for other groups even longer. And the reality is that it has never treated African Americans in an equitable basis. It's never focused on maintaining wellness for African Americans as it purportedly does for other people. So you can't simply talk about African American behavior. You've got to talk about the untrustworthiness of the healthcare system. If you build a trustworthy healthcare system, people will embrace it. They'll go to it. But if it's not trustworthy, you can't expect anyone to. And ours is definitely not trustworthy, not only because of 400 years of history, but because of things that are happening right now around, for example, vaccine distribution, around the championing of conducting unethical research in the developing world, around dispensing with informed consent, particularly for vulnerable populations. So these behaviors of the healthcare system deserve at least equal scrutiny, but they're not getting it. I also want to say that there are some economists who are working really hard at trying to remedy some of the inequities in terms of medication pricing and distribution. For people who accept that, at least for now, but people who accept that the capitalist system is not going to go away anytime soon and try to work within it, even there are solutions. The health improvement program is one of them. There are researchers at Yale who said that instead of allowing corporations to maintain a exclusive patent on every medication for an average of over 20 years, what we should do is reward corporations who devise medications that address important problems. And we should judge how much they're paid based on how many lives are saved or how many cases of disease are gotten rid of. And that should be a global assessment. Right now, the health of people, wealthy people in the Western world, is what drives healthcare agendas. Everyone wants to make drugs and treat these people because these people can pay a lot of money in return. That's why the developing world gets ignored. They simply can't afford expensive care. But under this kind of proposal, every life would be equally important. If you save the lives of 1 million people with malaria in the global south, the company would be rewarded the same as if they had saved the lives of 1 million Americans who are wealthy. And that's a much more equitable plan. Those kind of plans are being devised and they deserve our attention. But part of the reason why they're not getting our attention is that we prevent healthcare lobbyists. We're electing officials to safeguard our medical interests by passing laws that will benefit us. But instead, healthcare lobbyists pay these same officials to pass laws that benefit their countries. Lobbyists have no place in healthcare. They're circumventing the will of the American people. They're circumventing initiatives that would improve our health and protect our health, and we need to get rid of them. We need to pass whatever law we need to pass to banish lobbyists from healthcare. That's something we should start working on doing immediately. And until we live in the utopia where we don't have to worry about money being tied to healthcare, this would be the next best thing, I think.
Harriet?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'm looking at I just wanted in terms of Louis Farrakhan and the final call in December 2020, he is quoted in the final call as saying this, and this is the newspaper of the Nation of Islam. We will not accept your vaccine so you can slow down, because whenever you bring it out, it's for your people. You give it to them because we are not accepting death. You are the very representative of death itself, the pale horse. He is also, and then he also has said, don't let them vaccinate you with their history of treachery through vaccines, through medication. Are you listening? I say to the African presidents, do not take their medications. Now, this is what he said about the COVID vaccine. And, here we have that situation that we've been talking about throughout, tonight's presentation. There are the real abuses, that have been perpetrated against Black bodies and Black lives and Black minds. And at the same time, there is this kind of nonsense that's being peddled. And this vaccine, I think you have written on this, the vaccine has been vetted, is safe, is efficacious, and people need to get it. So we need to distinguish. I'm just sort of coming back, as you had asked.
Well, I'd
Here's
ask
the
you for an
quotation.
example, and so now you give me an example of what you're talking about. That's helpful. But I don't understand why people are more troubled by that than by the CIA and their behavior.
No,
So
I'm totally troubled
what
by
I'm
the
trying to
CIA.
say is that
Yeah.
what he is saying is that the vaccines are for the advantage of them and not us. And quite frankly, that's borne out historically. I think that's actually accurate.
He's
So
saying
the
don't take
biblical
it.
No, I didn't say don't take it. It's not exactly not at all what I said.
No, I'm
I've
saying
said
he is saying, I'm saying he's
I
saying
know
that.
what he's saying. I know what he's saying. I'm talking about, remember how I said that we need to approach people's fears with respect is a perfect example. Okay. He's expressing a fear a lot of people share. I think people should take the vaccine. That's not at all into contention. But when people have reasons for not taking the vaccine, I think it's really important to meet them with where they are and discuss them and not reject them out of hand. It's easy to label people's behavior. But what you quoted, the pith of what you quoted is he's saying that the vaccines are devised for them and not for us. And I actually agree with that. I know what he's saying. I don't agree with his conclusion that people should reject the vaccine, but I think it's really important. Again, what's the utility of rejecting someone's statement as being completely wrong and then leaving it there and laughable? I think it's really important to communicate with them, might be able to find some common ground or actually with any luck convince them that you're right, but it's really important to gauge with them where they are and not just label behaviors.
Okay, on this point, I just want to agree with you that we have to be that given this whole history and the ongoing abuse, that the concerns of the community, of the oppressed communities, the Black community, these are extreme, these are valid. And there needs to be, there right now, you have a system that has, that's murdering Black people. The police are murdering Black people. The healthcare system is killing Black people. The educational system is not serving the needs of Black people and other oppressed and exploited people. This is the ways in which the system, functions, has historically and continues to function. In this crisis, it's very important. There are people, Harriet, maybe you could speak about this, the National Medical Association, which is a professional organization of African American physicians. They have independently vetted the vaccine, as I understand it, to try to help people understand the science from the non-science in understanding what's going on, how to communicate, how to get this effectively into the communities. There are sections of people that are trying to work on this question, but within the constraints and confines of this, of this system. So I want to affirm what you're saying about listening to people, their concerns, and at the same time, there is the urgency of getting this vaccine to people.
Yes, except that it's a mistake to focus on urgency and finding a solution now. We're talking about abuses that have been going on for 400 years.
Yeah.
And trying to do everything quickly is a problem. We're not going to solve the problem of a healthcare system that's untrustworthy and people's logical reaction to it within a few months or weeks. We would love to do that. It'd be convenient to do that, but it's not realistic. And it's not fair to put the onus on people to change their behavior, pivot and change their behavior immediately. Because frankly, the healthcare system hasn't changed its behavior. So again, this focus on African American behavior as if, it's interesting how we're always expected to solve the problem, even though we have been the victims of the problem. And looking for speed is not always the most effective way of getting things done. If we come up, we need to fix the system. We need to fix it permanently. We don't want to be reinventing the wheel every time we have a healthcare challenge. If there are things that we're doing that make a lot of sense, I agree with. Having African American doctors, for example, take the vaccine very publicly, espouse the vaccine. That's social marketing, and it's very appropriate. It's good, but it's not enough. As long as you have a system that is abusing people, that people are always afraid they're going to be abused in it, then you're always going to have this problem. So you need to focus on fixing the system, and I don't think that's going to be an overnight, project.
Fair enough. Hearing it from you in those terms, Harriet. The argument that we're making here is that we can't fix this system. It's unfixable and unreformable.
I know that's your stance.
Right. We need to make but I mean, say it can be empirically demonstrated. I mean, your work is contributing to the understanding of its historic and ongoing failure. And what is that a product of? And it's the white supremacy that's built into it. It's the ways in which it's governed, as I said, by profit. It's an economic structure that delimits every decision that's made and conditions, those outcomes. So we do need to make a revolution to solve this. And there is a strategy to make this revolution. People can go to revcom.us. We are talking about getting rid of this system, overthrowing this system when the conditions are right, and building a movement for revolution so that we can actually create a just and equitable healthcare system as part of a society that is meeting the needs of the people and contributing to the revolution to put an end to all oppression and exploitation worldwide. People should go to revcom.us. We can have more discussion about this.
I think we're in agreement.
Yeah.
I think we're in agreement about what has to happen, and maybe we disagree about how it's going to happen, but that's okay. We don't have to agree about everything. We're in agreement about the really important things.
But that's the important, but it is a communist revolution that we're talking about, to put an end to this very economic, structure that we're talking about, and to actually to go to work on uprooting all of these horrific forms of oppression, whether it's the oppression of women, people of color, what the system does to the environment, the wars. I mean, I think it's very important for people in the listening audience to hear what you're saying about how the US empire, it is an imperial empire, uses medicine and abuses medicine in pursuit of, its greater, global interest. So, all of these things are important. And I think we need to learn from the work that you're doing. And we have to continue this dialogue and debate about whether you can fix the system, or if we have to get rid of the system, which I think the case is very strongly made here, then the strategy for that, the vision that's embodied in the Constitution for the new socialist republic in North America. And, we'll continue this. I want to bring in some other questions here from the audience, okay? Someone asked, at what point do these abuses of medical consent constitute criminal behavior? What is the role of falsification of medical records when physicians have the invention, I think they meant it's the intention of violating informed consent. Is that another aspect of criminal behavior? Please say more about the financial incentives that can result in physician willingness to violate informed consent.
In terms of criminal behavior, what makes this so insidious is that by changing the law, they're actually legalizing what used to be criminal behavior. They're moving it from the realm of criminality to legality. The fact that it's legal does not make it ethical, does not make it right. But there's a lot of the practices are indeed legal. So we need to change the law. We need to revert back to an ethical law. So as long as, you can't prosecute people for not for doing things that are legal, but there is some hope in that the way the trials are conducted is often violating parts of the law, tenets of the law. I might have alluded to the fact that, for example, during the Polyheme trial, the law says that you can only force people to take the experimental therapeutic as long as the standard of care is unavailable, which means that when they get to the hospital, subjects should be given blood or saline or some standard of care. But instead, they keep getting the Polyheme for 12 hours. So that actually was breaking the law. Nothing was done about that. I couldn't find anywhere in like the reams and reams I wrote about that. I could find nobody challenging the law. The one person who challenged the law was Nancy King in North Carolina. She's the person who found that the study that took away informed consent was violating the North Carolina Patient Bill of Rights. So she was able to stop the study for a while, but they got a waiver eventually and were able to continue it. The fact that they were allowed to continue that study, even though she showed it was breaking their law, they basically bent the law to do it, means that criminal penalties are going to be very hard to enact. I think I'm more optimistic. Personally, I would prefer for us to try to revoke the law so it would no longer be legal. Revoke the law. And there are a lot of reasons why I think, and I hope that could be done. Part has to do with transparency. The fact that this was enacted and the people affected, you and me, lay people, knew nothing about it, had no voice in it. I find really troubling. But in order to change the law, what I've pointed out is that it would be really important for lawmakers to hear from us, to hear from people who are saying, this is unacceptable. We want you to introduce legislation to restore our protection, restore informed consent. And so I'm always urging people, whatever group you're part of, fraternal organization, NAACP, Sierra Club, I don't care, whatever group you're part of, try to get this on the agenda. Try to get people there involved in trying to roll back these unethical laws so they'll no longer have protection of the law. But, until that happens, I don't, criminal charges will be very hard to brought up. And you make a good point, too, about falsification, because, when in the trial of ketamine, the one that Elijah McCain was killed in, what happens often is ambulance attendants, I wrote in the book, they have to make a case for giving ketamine. And so what they'll say is that, oh, when we got there, this person was angry, they were kicking, they were combative, we had to give them ketamine to calm them down. Well, I wrote about one case where they said that, but then the person's lawyer or representative, I forget exactly who it was, got the ambulance run record that didn't reflect any of that. It reflected that the woman they were talking about had been crying, said she didn't want to go to the hospital, asked them not to give her ketamine, but she didn't kick or fight, whatever. So that's falsification by the attendants. They'd be legally liable for that. So there is some hope in terms of looking at individual cases and finding where they have, actually broken letter of the law. But I'm more optimistic about the effects of actually rolling the law back. That will protect a lot more people.
Harriet, can I share more questions?
Sure.
Yeah, I just want to bring as many from the audience into this. Remember earlier, someone asked about coercive experimentation in Puerto Rico with vaccines and other testing and medical procedures.
Okay. So in Puerto Rico, there's a long history of subjugating people to research without their permission. A very long history of this. A lot of reproductive studies were done. The birth control pill was devised in Mexico. Hispanic women have frequently been used outside of this country and in this country, reproductive agenda, and they often were not given informed consent. They often were not told what was being tested on them, what was being devised. And even when they were, the studies sometimes were so dangerous they shouldn't have been conducted. For example, Depo-Provera was tested on women in the US and in Puerto Rico. And the analysis by a toxicologist said that this is a potent carcinogen. You shouldn't be giving it to women as a contraception, but they were, but they took care to do it outside the country. So there are patterns of US researchers outside the country. I've already talked about research in Africa, Brazil, Thailand. Same thing has happened, in the countries south of our borders. It's very cheap, easy, and again, the oversight is often easy to elude. There's the law does provide for oversight of these studies, but the law doesn't provide much funding for it. So you end up with very little oversight. And so the oversight is so spotty that sometimes there isn't even any policy, any procedural guides for it. So even if you did by chance have people who were concerned about it, there's no clear indication about how to go forward. So oversight is simply not it's certainly given short shrift, particularly in research in the developing world.
Someone wanted to hear more about experimentation in the prisons in the US and around the world by the
Well,
drug.
it's interesting because industrialized Western countries don't usually allow research in prisons. Our country does, I believe New Zealand does, I think that's it. Now, of course, in prisons in other countries, poorer countries, the global south, people are going to be abused. But in this country, we have horrific research and we have a horrific history. Not only research that was done that was bloody, dangerous, where you had men en masse having horrible infections, having just really crude and given chemicals that will erode their skin put on them, things that were just horrific, things that you would not do to laboratory animals. But not only that, even as far back as the 1960s, informed consent was taken away. What would happen is that one particularly really, really horrible study was testing curare derivatives on men. Curare is a chemical that makes one paralyzed. It's used for surgery. And you give it to the person, they become paralyzed, they can't move, and they can't breathe. So if you give someone curare, you have to quickly put them on a ventilator or give them breathing support. When they were testing it, they would give it to prisoners, right? And so the prisoners would describe it like, it's like if you were drowning, but you were handcuffed. You can't breathe and you can't move. And the word got out quickly, and prisoners began saying, I'm not going to be in that study. They kept rejecting it. So the prison board decided, we will give permission for you and force men into the study. They themselves would sign the informed consent form. So of course there was no real consent. But I submit that in prisons, there's no real consent anyway. Prisons are inherently coercive atmosphere. It's like being enslaved. You cannot give consent. You know, if you look at the Nuremberg Code, the wording is interesting. The very first tenet says the voluntary consent of the subject is essential. Voluntary consent, is that redundant? No, because you can elicit people's consent in many ways. You can threaten them into giving consent. You can beat them into giving consent. You can force them into giving consent. And in prisons, the consent is not voluntary. Many people in prisons have to give consent. They have to do it for many reasons. First of all, the prison laboratory has traditionally been a safe haven. You know, a lot of prisons are very dangerous areas where you can be assaulted, raped, stabbed, but the prison research area is generally safer. Also, prisons, the money that men earn from prison studies, is it's not much money, but it's much, much more than they can make any other kind of labor. You know, if they make 30 cents a day working the laundry, well, they can make, you know, $300 from a research study. And that money is often used to buy their freedom. You know, get a bail bondsman to take 10% of their bail. They can earn enough money in research study to actually buy their freedom. So that is, they call that undue, undue influence in medical ethics lingo. I call it coercion. You know, again, prisons are coercive atmosphere, coercive societies, and the money is sometimes your price of freedom. It's sometimes your price of safety, and so. Frankly, I don't think that prisoners can give free consent, and we should not allow research in prison. Other countries don't. In 1970s, the abuses had gotten so bad, so much bad publicity, that prisons were closed to medical research. The only studies you could conduct were studies you could show that would benefit prisoners, supposedly. But then in 2005, we reversed ourselves. The IOM had a panel that decided to open prisons up to research. What's interesting about that is that somebody called me about that. And they said, we're going to have this panel. We're going to debate about whether to reopen prisons to research. And they said to me, what's your opinion on that? So I was wary of sharing my opinion. I didn't know what the effect would be. And I said the truth, which is that I would have to be there, hear the discussions, get all the information, and make my decision. I can't make a decision without, they didn't invite me to be on the panel, so sure I am. And they did decide to open prisons back up. So I already wrote Medical Apartheid about some of the troubling studies that were taking place after that. And I expect, to see a lot more abuses in the future. It's just complete insanity, completely unethical, and a very, very sad thing that we permit to happen. To use basically incarcerated, enslaved people as guinea pigs is totally unacceptable. But we're doing it.
Harriet, we're getting a lot of thank yous to you for your presentation, and a number of people have asked how they can get in touch with you. I don't know if there's if these are if you have a way in which people can write you.
I'll give my let's see. That's always problematic because I want to be in touch with people, but my email box has got 14,000 emails in it right now.
So that's why it takes you a while to answer me.
I'm very busy. It's true. Yeah. You know what? If I give you an email address, okay, could you do you have a way of disseminating it to people?
Well, yeah, or can they write your publisher? Maybe that's is there like the publisher? If someone is asking, can we write the publisher?
That might be a good solution. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's do that. Okay. So how would that be?
Good question.
I have the
Let me look it up. Their website should have an address on it. Columbia Global Reports.
Well, why don't we say that people should write Columbia? Do us. Are you looking that up now? But in the interest of time, people should go to Columbia Global Reports. Okay.
Yeah, put
Uh,
my name on it so
put
they'll
your
know to, yeah.
right. So,
Harriet
attention.
Washington in care of Columbia Global Reports.
Right.
Yeah.
And uh, what I have here is globalreports.columbia.edu, facebook.com, Columbia Global Reports at Columbia GR. Okay. So,
Yeah. I think they also have a Twitter account. So you
okay.
could send a message via Twitter.
Right.
But as long as my name is on it to make sure they can easily just send it to me. And
Right. So
okay.
the operative information here is Columbia Global Reports, attention, Harriet Washington. Right. So
Sounds good.
um, I think we'll end the program now. It's been so stimulating and a lot of, it's 7 o'clock now, and I just wanted to say a few things about Revolution Books, and then give Harriet an opportunity to say any parting words that she'd like to share with the audience. So, um, I want to thank everyone for coming out to tonight's event, and I want to call on you to support and become part of the community of Revolution Books. We are a unique bookstore here in New York and in Berkeley. Uh, we are the political, intellectual, and cultural center uh, of a movement for an actual revolution. And this is a place, a space, a bookstore that values critical thinking, the poetic spirit, the unfettered search for the truth. And the beating heart of this bookstore is um, the work and leadership of Baba Avakian. He is the most important political thinker and leader in the world today, and he has developed what's called the new communism. And this is a whole new framework for human emancipation, the scientific method and approach for deeply understanding the world, learning from the diverse currents of thought and insight from wide range of thinkers and people contributing, in the different realms of the arts and the sciences and philosophy, to understanding the world, to be drawing from and learning from all of that. And this new communism, as I said, is the scientific method and approach to deeply understand the world in order to profoundly and deeply change it. And that is to make an actual revolution, to put an end to this capitalist imperialist system and all forms of oppression and exploitation. And this is all for the emancipation of humanity across the planet and to protect this planet from the environmental destruction that is ravaging it. So that's what this revolution, opens up. And there's no revolution without this scientific approach. There's no revolution without the imagination. There's no revolution without robust ferment, debate, the kind of dialogue we're having here tonight. And all the more reason for people to get involved with this bookstore, to come to the bookstore. You can go to our website and to donate. We are nonprofit, all volunteer. We count on you. We rely on you to support this bookstore with your financial donations, with your ideas. Mention us in your social media and tell people about this bookstore. And you can make a donation in the ways that you see on the screen here right now. And, we have been hit, financially by this pandemic. We are complying with the health, requirements to keep it safe, the numbers of people that can come in. But this has pinched the store financially. And we have to all work together to make this bookstore an even brighter beacon for a whole new world. So, with that, I want to thank everyone for coming out and really send my warm thanks to Harriet for her presentation and for the work that she's doing, exposing the horrors of this system and standing for, ethics at a time when these kinds of concerns and this kind of compassion, that she brings to the discourse, is not the currency in this society and in this system. So I want to thank you for coming. And if you want to say any parting words, do so.
Thank you. And just briefly, what I want to say is that the right to say yes or no to medical research is an essential protection. Since Nuremberg, since we closed the books on the worst abuses of unconscionable research with African Americans, we don't want to risk those nightmares returning. And so it's very important for you to talk to your legislator, reach out, let them know this concerns you deeply, so we can work together to roll back this horrible abuse and free ourselves from investigational servitude. Thanks so much for listening to me tonight.
And thank you again, and thank the audience, and we'll see you soon. Good night.